Holy Gospel according to John, the 13th chapter.
Glory to you,
Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The Gospel of our Lord.
praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. A few weeks ago, I was blessed to attend a Via de Cristo weekend, the quarterly spiritual retreat and learning experience hosted by a fantastic bunch of Lutherans of northern Texas. And I was at a reunion of this group this past weekend, and I ran into Calvary member Jim Cronkite there. And we were talking, and I said to him, "I'm preaching on Maundy Thursday." And Jim said, "You know that whole love one another commandment? That's really important." That's the whole point. So, Jim, I just want to say thank you for the sermon help. And now I'm going to talk about foot washing. Two years ago, I went for the first time to a Maundy Thursday worship service where foot washing was a part of the service. It was a church on the west side of Chicago where seminarian Chris Michaelis was serving at the time. There were a few chairs in the front of the sanctuary and a bowl of water and a towel at each of them. And at a certain point in the service, the congregation was invited to come up to the chairs for the ritual if they wished. And I don't remember exactly how it worked out, but it worked out that everyone got to wash someone else's foot and also have their own foot washed. And it made me uncomfortable, especially the part where I had to let someone else wash my feet. I can wash my own feet, you know? And to make it even weirder, I didn't know the person washing my foot. But I decided to try it. And the man who washed my foot and I smiled at each other. Now, the act of foot washing makes me think about all the people whose regular job it is, day in and day out, to enter into those spaces that I might find just a little bit uncomfortable. I think of the woman who gave me a pedicure yesterday. The man who picks up my trash and the trash of others in my building 3 times a week on the curb outside of my apartment. The nurses who care for us in the hospital and regularly enter into our most vulnerable spaces. It's one thing to hear a story or to see an example of love. It's another to actually act it out. You will never wash my feet, Peter said to Jesus. And I just wonder what goes through Peter's head in that moment. I wonder if he thinks, Jesus, you are too good to do this. You are teacher and Lord, and this just doesn't make any sense. I should be serving you. Classic Peter, right? Not really getting it right away. And then when Jesus says, unless I wash you, you have no share with me, Peter says, well then go ahead, wash my hands and my head too. He just wants to share in it all, captivated by what Jesus is saying. Now, Peter is often the voice of all of the disciples, and so often then Peter is often the voice, I think, of all of us. So it's good that we hear Jesus, the one who is from God and who is going to God, the one who loves us in the world and to the end, explain this to us. I have set you an example, Jesus says, and it's an example that we can live out in the world. It's an example that we live out every time we welcome and serve and get up early to serve and talk to and treat with dignity a person who does not have a place to call home. Every time we work on a quilt or another project for a refugee or a war veteran, or fill a big soup pot with change so that someone else who doesn't have a meal might eat. Every time we clean up a community kitchen or rake leaves on a community property. Every time we care for someone who has fallen sick, or go to the hospital to visit someone and their family, or to visit someone in their time of grief. As you can tell, I've racked up quite a few examples during my time in internship so far. We don't do these things, y'all don't do these things because of money or material gain. We do them. You do them because of love. It's an example that Jesus sets for us that leads to the new commandment that Jesus gives the disciples. John's version of the most important commandment. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself is summed up in the Gospel of John as simply to love one another. And perhaps this implies that by loving one another, we are loving God. Beginning with Ash Wednesday this year on my Lenten journey, I've thought about how sin can separate us from seeing God in one another like I never have before. And I've also seen the face of God in other people like I never have before. I think it started downtown Fort Worth at lunchtime at Ash Wednesday, when two separate businessmen on two different occasions dressed up in nice business suits came up to me and asked for the imposition of ashes. I was kind of in awe. I couldn't believe that I had something that these men who at first seemed so successful and well off and not really in need of anything wanted from me. But as I looked into their eyes and I imposed the ashes on their forehead and I said those words, "Remember that you are dust and to dust you shall return," and I heard their amen, I saw the face of God in the other who had seemed so different from me. And in that way I was connected with them. In that way I saw God. And this call to respond with love is a call to us, the church. It is up to us, this call to respond to each other and to our world in love. This commandment of Christ was not spoken to the crowds, not spoken to the outsiders, but to the disciples themselves, to us. The world may present us with hatred and persecution, bitterness and anger, violence and destruction and murder, hurt and betrayal. And in the midst of it all, living out our faith as Christians, we are called by this commandment to love one another. The commandment is not to agree with one another. The commandment is not to always like every single thing that the other is doing. The commandment is to love one another. And Jesus says, if you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And I think we could be here all night if I were to go around this sanctuary right now and ask everyone to share a story about a time that you were blessed by loving someone else. Because I am sure that each of us has several stories about the blessing of love in our lives. It is a blessing that is meant to be shared. So even though Peter may seem a little over-enthusiastic, wanting to share in it all with Jesus, maybe he's not so over-enthusiastic after all. Because it is too real what we share in with Jesus. We share in the suffering and the humility. We share in the life of the world. We can also share with Jesus in the new vision for humanity, a community where there is not one who is above the other, but where all serve each other with love. The Son of humanity was glorified on the cross, is glorified on the cross, where Jesus gives up his life out of love for the world, so that humanity might have new life. In the broken bread and the cup of wine of the new covenant, We are freely given the body and blood of Christ. We become the body and blood of Christ. And we are freed to live out love. That's the whole point.